What's up? Welcome back to another video. My name's Michaela, aka Moe Kickz, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you guys this real simple, beginner-friendly drip swoosh design. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, then keep on watching. So if you don't plan on freehanding this design and you want to make a stencil, the first thing you want to do is upload an actual picture of the swoosh so you have a reference. And then there's a few different ways you could draw the actual drips. You could either draw them to follow along the outer curve of the swoosh. That way when they're cut, they fit close to the actual shape, and if you do it correctly, you'll have minimal cutting and adjusting that you'll need to do when you lay the stencil down. Or you could draw each drip separately. That way you have the freedom to adjust the drip along any part of the swoosh as you'd like. So if you're making a stencil for each drip separately, you want to make sure that you put a nice curve on each side of the drip. That way it gives you the freedom to place the stencil anywhere along the swoosh. When placing the stencil on the shoe, you want to make sure that at least one side of the drip is lined up to the edge of the swoosh and that the other side is overlapping onto the swoosh. You'll know if you don't line it up correctly because there will be this awkward gap in between the swoosh and the drip. So as you can see here, the left side of my stencil is lined up to the edge of the swoosh and the right side is overlapping onto the swoosh. Here, the left side of the stencil is lined up to the edge of the swoosh, but the right side isn't even touching the swoosh. So when you start cutting off the excess stencil, you're going to notice that there's a gap between the swoosh and the drip. If you need a more in-depth tutorial on how to upload your file to Cricut Design Space and cut your stencil out, I do have a tutorial on that, as well as a tutorial on how to lay your stencils down correctly onto the shoe. So if you want to check that out, I will link it down in the description below for you. Before I show you guys how I use the stencils that I cut out on my Cricut, I'm going to show you how you could make a stencil for these drips if you do not have a vinyl cutter. So you're going to just need a thick piece of tape and lay it down on your shoe, make sure it's nice and flat, and then you're going to go in and draw the drips on there by hand. Now they don't have to be perfect, but it's just to give you a good idea of the shape of your drips. Next you're going to go in with an X-Acto knife and first cut off the tape that's covering the swoosh. And then go in with the weeding tool and tuck the tape in underneath the swoosh just to make sure there's no gap in between the swoosh and the tape. Next, you're going to take that X-Acto knife and cut along the shapes that you drew onto the tape. Make sure you have a nice sharp blade, that way it makes this process a lot easier, but you also want to be careful and not cut too deep because you will cut into the leather. Now I'm going to show you how I use the stencils on the actual shoe. I had originally cut out the stencils so that they were supposed to fit along the curve of the swoosh, but either I measured incorrectly or my drawing was off. But I tried to place the stencil on as a whole off camera, and it didn't line up the way I wanted it to, so I ended up cutting it in sections and just found that this way was a lot easier, and I could place the drips along the swoosh wherever I wanted. So now I'm lining up my stencils along the swoosh just like how I showed earlier on my iPad, and then cutting off the excess stencil so that the swoosh isn't covered, and tucking the stencil behind the swoosh so that there's no gaps in between the swoosh and the stencil. As I mentioned earlier, I do have a separate tutorial on how to place your stencils onto the shoes. It's more than just sticking it onto the shoe and then painting over it. There are a few extra steps that you can do to make sure that when you peel the stencil off, your design comes out nice and clean. I will be airbrushing the color on, so before I do that, I'm going to tape off any of the gaps that are in between the stencil, as well as tape off the areas around the swoosh. An extra step you can take to make sure your design comes out nice and clean once you peel off that stencil is by first painting a thin layer of the same color that's underneath your stencil. So in my case, the color underneath my stencil is black, so I'll be using a thin layer of black paint along the edges of the stencil, so that in theory, if this paint does bleed underneath, it'll match the color that's behind the stencil. Once you have that first layer, it creates a barrier and pretty much prevents your next layer from also bleeding underneath. You don't have to do this extra step, but it does help, especially when you're painting by brush or if you're painting on a very textured surface. So with my design, I chose to make the outer swooshes have a few drips that were long enough that they drip onto the midsole. And if you're going to do this, you're going to want to add a little bit of Too Hard to your paint. This is just an adhesion promoter because this paint doesn't typically stick very well to non-porous surfaces like the midsole, which is like this plastic rubber material. So you just want to make sure that you're reading the directions on the back and adding the correct amount of Too Hard to your paint. With paint additives, you want to make sure that you don't add too much or too little because then it won't work the way it was intended. So I just mixed a little Too Hard with my black, and I'm only using that on the areas where the midsole will be painted. And then I'm just going in with the regular black on the leather areas. As I've mentioned in my previous videos, whenever I have an area of the shoe that's originally a dark color, and in this case black, I like to go in with a light gray to lighten that dark color up. This just makes sure that the color I use turns out nice and bright. If I just took red and painted directly on top of that black, it's going to give it kind of a different undertone and it won't be as bright as it was intended to be. Once you're done painting, you can start peeling off all that tape and the stencils. Whenever I'm peeling off stencils, I like to heat it up a little bit with my heat gun just to soften up the stencil and make it easier to peel back. And this is where you can start to see where you're going to need to do some touch-ups. Now this happens to just about every shoe I customize, but it's most noticeable on black Air Forces. Whenever I peel off my tape, it always leaves sticky residue on the midsole. And so in order to get rid of that, you can just use one of these rubber cement erasers and it'll just come right off. All of the products I use in this video you can find on my Amazon storefront, which I'll have linked down below in the description. And so here's the finished product. Let me know what you guys think. If you guys have any questions, leave it down in the comments below and I'll try my best to answer them. And let me know what you guys would like to see next. As always, if you like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And make sure you turn on post notifications to get notified every single time I post a new video.